The case of the Queen against Elgar is in its third and final day. After having pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to obtain money by deception, he now faces further charges in connection with a fire at his shop premises. Yesterday, under cross-examination by the prosecution, he broke down and admitted that he had set fire to the shop. He was unable to continue giving evidence, and the court adjourned early.
My lord, my client is now sufficiently recovered to resume his testimony.
I'm glad to hear it. And the defendant's mother?
Oh, I'm happy to say she is, after all, going to be well enough to appear as a witness.
Then I take it that there is no question of a change of plea.
No, my lord.
Very well. The defendant may return to the witness box. Mr. Parsons, have you concluded your cross-examination?
No, my lord.
I would remind you, Mr. Elgar, that you are still on oath. And I would remind the jury that everything the defendant said in the witness box yesterday was also on oath. Now it is up to you to attach what importance you think right to certain utterances which were made, possibly hysterically, impulsively, or under stress. Parsons?
Thank you, my lord. Now, Mr. Elgar, just before we adjourned yesterday, you admitted that you had set fire to your premises. Do I understand you now wish to retract that admission?
Yes.
Very well. Well, I'd now like to ask you some questions concerning the paraffin can that was found in your shop premises. You may recall the testimony of Fire Officer Pettit of the Fulchester Fire Brigade, who said he found a 5-gallon drum in the back room, which was empty, though it had clearly contained paraffin because of the smell from it. Now, you put that there, did you not?
Yes, I've already said that.
Yes, I know. You'll just bear with me for one moment. Was the can full or empty when you put it there?
It was full.
Now, how did you acquire it?
Well, I bought it from the ironmonger's.
Yes. Am I right in saying you bought it from Squire's hardware store, Denman Street, Fulchester?
Yes.
Now, can you recall when you bought it?
Sometime in September.
Yes, to be exact, the 18th of September last. Would that be right?
I suppose so.
You suppose? Well, that's the date I have in a copy of a receipt here from Squire's hardware store. Would you dispute this?
No.
No. So on September the 18th, 4 days before the fire at your shop, you placed a large can of paraffin in the back room. Now, you've explained to the court that the reason for this was that in the winter you were going to heat that back room with a paraffin heater. You had not yet decided which model to buy.
That's right.
So, will you please tell the court, why did you buy all this paraffin to fill a heater you hadn't yet bought?
I just saw it in the ironmonger's and I bought it.
Well, I mean, would you buy petrol if you didn't have your van?
That's an absurd analogy.
Well, I'm sorry you find it absurd. I'll tell you what I find absurd, Mr. Elgar, what I find utterly preposterous, and that's a series of limp, implausible explanations you've given this court. I'll ask you one more question about the can, and perhaps this time you can summon up an answer that has a ring of truth about it. Station Officer Pettit said that when he found the can after the fire, the tap at the bottom was in a diagonal position. That is to say, it was neither fully closed nor fully open. Now, how do you account for that?
Well, I can't.
You can't. Or did you put the tap in that position when you left the can there?
No.
Well, how do you think it got like that?
The only thing I can think of is that in moving furniture around in that room, somehow something knocked against it and budged it a little.
Somehow something knocked against it and budged it a little. Well, that answer is just about as convincing as most of your other answers. Let me ask you something that requires a simple yes or no. Would you say that if someone wanted to start a fire somewhere, a very good way to do it would be to leave a large can of paraffin dripping slowly so that everything in the vicinity became soaked in paraffin?
Well, it'd be just as easy to pour all the paraffin straight out.
Yes, either way, very effective.
I imagine so.
You imagine?
I have no experience of starting fires.
Well, I now come to the evidence given by your friend and former partner, Gerald Stroud. You heard him testify that he visited you at the shop on September 19th last, 3 days before the fire, and found you upset and angry about a letter you had received from the landlords about the higher rent. Now, was Mr. Stroud correct in describing you as upset and angry?
Yes.
And am I right in saying that as a result of that letter, you made 2 phone calls to the landlords, Messrs. Chester and Hussey?
Yes.
And in fact, in the second phone call, you became quite abusive, did you not?
Not really abusive, no.
No? Mr. Stroud has testified that you told him you were going to refuse to sign the new lease and that you said the shop can go up in flames for all I care. But you've denied this. You claim you said the shop can go to blazes for all I care.
That's right.
Go to blazes. Now, that's a rather old-fashioned phrase, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought it was still in common usage.
I simply meant the shop could go to hell.
Yes, or something much more inflammatory. But you are asking the court to believe that in a moment of anger, you would say, go to blazes. What you said was, the shop can go up in flames for all I care, and that is precisely what you meant. Because, in a fit of pique and anger with your landlords, you decided to set fire to the premises. You then went out and bought a 5-gallon can of paraffin. You then decided to cheat your insurance company by buying the most expensive antiques you could afford, concealing them in your van, and then adding them to the claim, along with everything else that had been destroyed or damaged in the fire. No further questions.
And you wish to re-examine, Mr. Lotterby?
Yes, briefly, my lord. Mr. Elgar, whereabouts is this ironmonger's, Squires, where you bought the paraffin?
In Denman Street.
Is that far from your shop?
No, it's just round the corner.
Mm-hmm. Do they know you in there? I mean, do they recognise you know where your shop was?
Oh, yes.
Well, why didn't you go further afield to get your paraffin, to somewhere where you weren't known?
Why should I?
Exactly. Why should you? Thank you, Mr. Elgar.
Mr. Elgar, I wish to ask you a question.
Yes, my lord.
Which I think your counsel has neglected to do.
My lord?
You have testified that you kept a dozen or so blankets in the back room used for packing.
Yes.
Now, were those blankets in the same part of the room as the can of paraffin?
No, they were on the opposite side.
Members of the jury, you will remember that the fire officer, Mr. Pettit, testified that if the fire had started amongst the blankets, as opposed to amongst the wooden furniture, that it might have smouldered for several hours so long as the blankets were not close to the paraffin.
I'm deeply indebted to your lordship. Something I'd quite overlooked.
Yes, I rather thought it was, Mr. Lotterby. You may return to the dock.
I call Marion Elgar.
Marion Elgar, please.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the Bible in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Your name is Marion Elgar, and you live at Briar Cottage, Haley Hill, Fulchester?
Yes.
And you are the mother of the defendant, Peter John?
Yes.
Mrs. Elgar, I understand that you've been brought here by ambulance from Fulchester Royal Infirmary and that it is waiting to take you back.
Yes.
You may be seated if you wish.
I'd rather stand.
I promise that we will keep you here for as short a time as possible.
Thank you.
Mrs. Elgar, how long have you lived at your present address?
Many years. My husband, my late husband, bought the cottage just after the war. It must be, 27 years.
And am I right in saying that it is only in the last 2 years that your son, the defendant, has shared the cottage with you?
Yes. He came to join me when my health began to deteriorate.
Now, Mrs. Elgar, will you please tell the court what you remember of the evening of September the 22nd last?
Was that the night of the fire?
Yes, it was.
Well, Peter came home from the shop about the usual time.
What time was that?
Between 6 and past. We had a drink, some sherry.
You always have a drink?
No, only on Friday and Saturdays, and that was a Saturday. It's a habit that dates from my husband's time. He would only have a drink on Friday and Saturday evenings. I think Peter does the same. It's strange how habits pass on to...
Mrs. Elgar, you were saying you had a sherry?
Yes. And then Peter went into the kitchen to make the dinner.
That's customary, is it?
Yes, he's an excellent cook and he enjoys it, which I don't. Afterwards, we watched television.
Now, what time would that be when you'd finished the meal and were sitting down watching the television?
Well, I can't be sure. About 8:15, I should think. Yes, it must have been, because it was about an hour later that we got the phone calls.
Ah, yes. Now, would you please tell the court about those telephone calls?
Well, there were two of them. The first was from the police telling Peter the shop was on fire. And the second was from one of the tenants in the flats above the shop, phoning from a public coal box to say the same.
And what happened then?
Well, Peter dashed out and drove off. I heard one strike and he hadn't come in. In the morning, I found him sitting in the kitchen with his face and hands still black from the fire.
Are you quite certain that from the time your son came home from the shop at about 6:30 until the time the telephone rang at 9:20, he was at home in the cottage with you and never left?
Quite certain, yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Elgar.
Now, Mrs. Elgar, still on that same fateful evening, when your son went into the kitchen to prepare the meal, where were you?
In the sitting room.
Were you already watching television?
No, I don't think I watched television that evening before supper.
But you can't be sure.
Well, it's many months ago.
Yes, quite so, quite so. Now, how long would you say your son was in the kitchen preparing supper?
I really don't know. About half an hour or so.
Yes. Is there a back door in the kitchen?
Yes, it leads to the...
Yes, it leads to the garage at the side of the house, does it not?
Yes.
Now, suppose that you perhaps had been watching television and your son had gone out of that back door. Would you have heard him?
Yes.
You would have heard him go out?
I should have heard the door open and I'd have heard it close.
You're quite sure? Your hearing is good?
There's nothing wrong with my hearing.
But just suppose, Mrs. Elgar, suppose you had been watching television and your son had gone out of the back door, opening and closing it quietly.
What is it you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that if the meal had been something that more or less cooked itself, if it could be left over a low light, your son, in that half hour or so, could have driven into Fulchester, to the shop, and been back in time to put the meal on the table.
No, he couldn't. I'd have heard him. I'd have heard him go and I'd heard him come back. You've no right to make such a wicked insinuation. No right at all. He's suffered enough already. I won't stay here and listen to your wicked insinuations.
Mrs. Elgar.
You can go to blazes for all I care.
Mrs. Elgar, how old are you? How old are you, Mrs. Elgar?
Please answer the question, Mrs. Elgar.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I didn't hear what was asked.
Thank you, Mrs. Elgar. No further questions, my lord.
But I
That's all right, Mrs. Elgar. You may leave now unless Mr. Lotterby has some more questions for you. Thank you for coming from the hospital.